Hello, world history students. My name is Joe Motor, as you may already know. Today's lesson is going to be about the 7 myths of the Spanish Conquest. These myths came from a book written by Matthew Restall. These myths cover, as you guessed, the Spanish Conquest. So, going on to the first myth, we have the myth of exceptional men. What's this myth talk about? Well, the myth talks about how the few Spanish would have conquered the natives because they were exceptional men. And also talks about how the Spaniards were successful conquistadors because they, or at least their leaders, were exceptional men. How can we solve this one? This one's actually pretty simple. The author, Restall, dissects the narratives of Columbus, Cortez, and Pizarro, and their success was more due to luck rather than superiority. They had access to years of information because many Portuguese had been successful before them. Columbus was neither unique nor exceptional. He was following the patterns that were established by the Portuguese over 100 years earlier. And with that, we can put that myth to rest. On to our next myth. We have the myth of the King's Army. This myth is about how the Spanish conquest was undertaken by the king and his structured loyal army. The Spanish conquest was the work of soldiers organized in armies or army-like groups. Why did this myth last so long? Well, we only have the modern perception of armies, which leads to the assumption that their armies were the same, but in reality, this time of army wasn't established until much, much later. So how can we solve this one? Organized armies do not really form in Spain until the late 15 or 1600s, and we projected our idea of army on the past. The army was actually disorganized and consisted of young men that were trained in trade, and who were mainly just seeking opportunity. These men were more of a motley crew of merchants and artisans and farmers, but not soldiers. And these men went at their own risk, and they even had to provide their own money for the conquest. They were neither directed nor supported by the king, and these men were of an armed company seeking financial gain with no guarantees, and therefore developed a patronage with other conquistadors. So with that, we can put that myth to rest. The next myth is the myth of the white conquistador. This myth is about how conquistadors were white males, and the conquest was a conflict between white conquistadors and natives. The conquest of America's indigenous people was the exclusive work of Europeans. How can we solve this one? Well, discussing the role of native politics and allies and the role of Africans, many Africans and many more Indians took part. The opposite stance offered by the natives is that the Spaniards gained dominance during a native civil war. The natives, too, looked to exploit others for their own gains, and Africans arrived in the New World and then went on to become conquistadors themselves. And they even outnumbered the Spanish in many cases. With that alone, that one fact that the Africans, in some cases, outnumbered the Spanish, is enough to debunk this myth. And with that, the myth is debunked. On to the next myth. The myth of completion. This myth is about how all Latin Americans were under Spanish control quickly and completely. The different Spanish conquests were essentially completed following some years of fighting. With the finite end of conquests, societies firmly under Spanish and Roman Catholic control quickly emerged. Before we get into how to solve this, why is this one so important? Why is this myth really important? Well, the Spanish system of reward and ideology that the conquistadors were agents of God. It was believed that conquest was imminent, and God was in charge and on the side of the Spanish. And the Spaniards were trying to elevate themselves in society and please the crown at all costs. So how can we solve this? Well, actually, the conquest wasn't complete for centuries. Aztecs weren't the only natives in the region. Militia and cultural resistance remained, and after 1521, most of the wars of conquest in most of Mesoamerica would continue all the way to the 20th century. That alone is a big time difference between what this myth is explaining and what the actual truth is. Huge tracts of land remained unconquered, and Spanish America was filled with native revolt and continuation of war for a very long time. So with that, this myth is completely debunked. On to the next myth, which is the myth of miscommunication. Okay. This myth is about how all the central and significant elements of conquest were effectively communicated between Spaniards and native people. But there's two sides of this myth. One side is that there is a myth that the natives and Spaniards communicated perfectly and seamlessly. But side two of the myth is that they couldn't communicate at all. Again, why is this one important? Well, the Spaniards claimed that there were no miscommunications, and to avoid injustice and prove that they had asserted control. That's why that one's kind of important. It's a little bit less complicated than the last one, but how can we solve this one? Well, Riestall, the author, describes in depth the role of translators in human communication. And yes, there were misunderstandings, but in addition, the natives and Spaniards did not reach a degree of understanding ever, really. There's one thing that could maybe prove that this isn't a myth, and it's that Mesoamericans did have writing. But that is really small compared to all the other evidence that we have to debunk this myth. But if you want to argue that, yeah, they could have communicated seamlessly, well, you could say that they had writing, or the Mesoamericans had writing, but that's not really enough to prove it. With that, this myth is debunked. On to the next myth, which is the myth of native desolation. This myth is about how the conquest resulted in a comprehensive annihilation of indigenous society and culture. And it focuses on the utter devastation of the natives during and after the conquest. And on how they lost their sense of purpose and culture. And natives natives initially were viewed either as simple children or immortal heathens. And another part of this myth is that the natives believed that the Spaniards were gods. Why is this so dangerous to assume? Why is this myth so dangerous to assume? It's because this myth, it perpetuates the myth that natives were helpless and that their culture is completely dead. And another thing is, this is a racist assumption in a way. The problem is that the natives have been lumped into the category of Indian, which is often associated with a derogatory stereotype, when in fact many Indian cultures differed vastly. But how can we solve this myth? Well, native cultures proved resilient and adaptive, and many natives, especially allies, found opportunity in the conquest era transition. Yes, they suffered at the hands of conquest and disease, but they found ways to continue living their life, to preserve customs, and to adapt. The Indians were not entirely laid to waste. They retained a great amount of their identity and were not really servants to their masters. And even the natives had words for the Spaniards. They didn't call them godly, they just called them powerful. Two different things. Not gods, but they were powerful. And that debunks that myth. And on to the last myth, number 7 of the 7 myths of the Spanish Conquest, is the myth of superiority. This myth is about how the Spanish Conquest was successful because of the technological and cultural advantages of the Spaniards. Combining some of the above and adding some other components, the general idea that the conquest went the way that it did is because Spaniards, in one way or another, or a combination of ways, were superior to native people. Before we get into the solution, what is a standard measure of superiority? Weapons, technology, cultural advantage, intelligence, and the fact that they considered the Spaniards a civilization while they considered the natives barbaric. So how can we solve this one? Well, the Aztecs had much more to lose, so they were more willing to compromise, and the impact of weapons kind of tends to be exaggerated. But what actually made the conquest successful was disease, native disunity, weaponry, Spanish steel, culture of war, and home turf disadvantage. The Indians did not possess metal, and the Spaniards were able to use a longer, less brittle, lethal weapon at close range combat, but not one of these factors could have produced the outcome if not combined with another. The reason for the conquest is for a wide array of reasons. A wide array of reasons. And with that, we also debunked this myth. That concludes today's lesson on the 7 myths of the Spanish Conquest. I hope you learned something, because I know this is a lot, but I hope you found it interesting, and I will see you next class. Adios.